We have had Lizzy Swan waiting very patiently in the wings now to come and be our final speaker of the day. Lizzy, it's lovely to see you, and I'm really excited to hear from you about the research you're doing into the experience of girls and women who have ADHD. So without further ado, over to you.
Thanks so much, Hannah and Benny, for having me today. So I'm here today to talk to you about ADHD and girls. I'm Lizzy Swan, and huge thank you for joining me today, and inviting me here. And hopefully today together we're going to learn more about girls and women with ADHD. And I'm drawing on 20 years of classroom teaching and working with children, young people and adults in my role as SENCO, senior leader and head teacher of a special school, followed by postgraduate study of psychology. And hopefully today I'm going to share some awareness with you. And I also have ADHD. So I'm going to start off by looking at what is ADHD. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a condition that affects people's behaviour. People with ADHD can seem restless, may have trouble concentrating, and may act on impulse. And that's a diagnosis, a definition, that comes from the NHS website. And many people reading that will think, God, that's quite insufficient. And I would absolutely agree. And that's hopefully why we're here today, to add some meat to those bones. And this is a definition from Dr. Thomas Brown that I prefer and feels more applicable to me and many other people, particularly girls and women and people who identify as female. ADHD is a complex syndrome of developmental impairments of executive function, the self-management system of the brain. And if you've not already delved into the world of executive functioning, that's something that we will hit upon today. It's a system of mostly unconscious operations, and our executive functioning is often referred to as the self-management system of the brain. These impairments are situational variable, chronic, and significantly interfere with functioning in many aspects of a person's daily life. Many people I speak to say, oh, I think I've got ADHD. I identify with many of those things. But the aspect here is that they significantly interfere with functioning in many aspects of their life. So what is ADHD? There are three subcategories of ADHD: hyperactive or impulsive, inattentive, or combined. And what we're going to be exploring today is around girls and women with ADHD. Most girls and women with ADHD identify with inattentive ADHD. And what does that mean? It's about difficulties getting going, forgetfulness, distractibility, zoning out or daydreaming, time blindness. Time blindness is something I hadn't even heard of until a few months ago, when I read Gabor Mate's book, Scattered Minds, and about emotional dysregulation. And one of the reasons why this is quite challenging for professionals to identify is because so many of these elements can be internalized by girls and women, whereas so many of the symptoms of ADHD that are more commonly found with boys are externalized, and those are those hyperactive or impulsive aspects around hyperarousal, difficulty sitting still or waiting in line, fidgeting, that constant need to be on the go. And that hyperactivity or that impulsivity can be most commonly found with women, is also found internalized, that inner sense of restlessness, their mind constantly on the go, and that impulsiveness. And for women, and girls, there can be many, many negative consequences from uninhibited behaviours and rash decision making. Many women who identify or have got a diagnosis of ADHD refer to an ADHD tax that can be associated with impulsive spending or impulsive or rash behaviours. And we'll come on to that a little bit later. That combined ADHD diagnosis will be a combination of both hyperactive or impulsive and inattentive. And what that can look like in girls and women is elements of the inattentive criteria, but also manifesting that hyperactivity through, as you'll probably notice with me, over talking, interrupting others, making impulsive decisions, and that psychological or mental hyperactivity. So going back to Dr. Thomas Brown's definition of ADHD, and this is something that is being discussed more and more amongst professionals, is that deficit or challenges around executive functioning. And Dr. Thomas Brown clusters it together around these executive functions, challenges around initiation of tasks, getting started. I cannot tell you how much I anguish around what PowerPoint presentation template. Canva is one of the best things to ever happen to me, but also one of the worst things to ever happen to me, because I spend hours and hours of my time thinking about what Canva presentation model to use. Focus. That's not just about concentration, but it's also about sustaining that focus once the novelty is over. And again, that drips over into effort. I have intense periods of hyper focus, which is one of the best elements of my ADHD, but also one of the most challenging when it comes to sustaining it. And also about emotions and that regulation. Memory, we talk a lot in education around short-term memory now, thank goodness, but also around our long-term memory. And that self-regulation of behaviour. So assessment of ADHD in girls and women, why have we got so many challenges? So we have difficulties here around diagnostic tools and clinician awareness, because the diagnostic tools for ADHD are so skewed towards the male perspective. So much of it was that before 1980, there was no real understanding of anything other than the hyperactive model. And there have been no studies around girls until 2002. That's how recent this awareness is. If I could ask Hannah or Benny to give me an idea of how much time I've got left, that would be really helpful for me. That would be great. Going back to gender roles as well. So many of, thank you, Richard, that's great. So many of the misunderstanding, so much of the misunderstanding around ADHD is because girls will conform to gender roles. So a lot of the behaviour that we'll see is around that passive behaviour, one pushing themselves to conform. So professionals are trying to raise their, needing to raise their awareness, to more passive behaviour. Girls with ADHD, particularly those who have a higher IQ, will push themselves to just try harder, and they'll be masking their behaviour, particularly in the classroom and in the community. Those comorbidities around anxiety and depression, particularly when they reach puberty, often mask the underlying ADHD and can lead to misdiagnosis. And there I've hit on hormones, particularly around estrogen. So often with ADHD, when we start with, when girls start puberty, that's when the estrogen tends to cause fluctuations in their ADHD symptoms and can cause significant challenges around their mood regulation, but also impacts on their executive functioning skills. And as many people are starting to understand, estrogen has a really close link to dopamine, which is what helps with the regulation of mood. And girls and women have so many changes across their lifespan, which is why so much of the diagnosis of women with ADHD is happening around the time of perimenopause. It's not just around women who are identifying or getting diagnosis for ADHD around the same time as their children. It also happens around the same time as the perimenopause, because it's that decline in estrogen causes an increase in their ADHD symptoms. So I'm going to move through a couple of these because, as you can imagine with ADHD, I've got so much to say on this topic. One of the risk factors we've got with girls and women with ADHD is around their impulsivity. It's not just about blurting out, it's also their risk factor for sexual behaviours. Girls with ADHD have got to double their risk of teenage pregnancy and accidents. Research came out in 2013 and again in 2021 that the risk of premature death is doubled if their treatment isn't effective for ADHD. Effective treatment for ADHD has the possibility of adding, on average, 9 to 13 years. So what can we do as educators? We can provide examples of what's expected and manage expectations, provide explicit instructions, clear steps and nudges, use a hands-down approach with girls so they're less likely, because they will be less likely to volunteer answers. Encourage headphones, loops and white noise, and get neurodiverse professionals to come in to support that risk assessment. We can also ensure that all staff are aware of the pupil's specific needs and have a highly trained adult to lead that social skills support, and be aware of those subtle differences around an inattentive ADHD diagnosis. And that support around executive functioning difficulties is absolutely critical to supporting girls with ADHD in schools. And I would be absolutely so remiss of me not to talk about strengths, because it's starting to feel like a deficit model here. We are the most creative, empathetic, and absolutely resilient learners and workers, because we have periods of hyper focus. And as they say, if you want a difficult job doing, we can get it done in half the time. So what we don't want anybody to think is that this is a deficit of cognitive ability. And this is my favourite definition that's currently out there from Hallowell and Ratey. ADHD is a term that describes a way of being in the world. It's not entirely a disorder, nor entirely an asset. It's an array of traits specific to a unique kind of mind. It can be a distinct advantage or an abiding curse, depending on how a person manages it. So I'd like to thank you all for being with me today to try and raise awareness, and I'm open to questions. Thank you, Benny.
Lizzy, that was fascinating, and I've got so much going through my brain, so I'm going to try and narrow it down to some tangible questions. So this, one of the things that you hear a lot in school is that ADHD, doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It's just poor parenting, or it's just behavior issues. Now, this is wildly frustrating, surely. When you hear this as an adult with a diagnosis, what is your reaction?
And I think it's really challenging when Super Nanny goes on Instagram and posts, like she did a couple of days ago, saying that, we could bring back naughty and ADHD and ABCD, because she's adding fuel to the fire there. And that is, I think, there's so much research where we're using brain scans, and we're actually starting to really focus on the neuroscience. Yeah. Because there's so much evidence, and it's
You're allowed
frustrating to me. I can't actually find the words, really. I think the focus now on executive functioning skills, and where we can actually look at the cognitive science, and we can break it down into that, moving it away from ADHD, I think is actually helping teachers focus on, actually, I can understand this. If I look at short-term working memory, long-term memory, if I look at organizational skills, I can manage this in my classroom, and I can see the tangible benefits and how this fits in, rather than actually looking at this as being something. I've heard you talking to Esther about, nebulous concepts, and so often teachers feel disempowered in the classroom. Whereas when you talk about ADHD in the realm of it being executive functioning skills, I think teachers start to think this is something that actually I can support this young person with.
Yeah. I think definitely. That shift in language, it's subtle, but the diagnosis of ADHD, I think, has carried so many connotations and judgments, and sort of lack of belief, lack of belief in its existence, that I think actually the executive function part is really useful. And moving to the gendered nature of this, this talk that you've just given, I think previously, certainly in my experience, that people had thought that ADHD was a boys' issue. It was something to do with boys. And when you look at some of the things that are risk factors for girls, I wonder if they get dismissed because they are seen as very gendered, impulsivity, likely to get pregnant, all of those things are dismissed as sort of gendered behaviors, as opposed to an ADHD thing.
I think so. I think when it comes to the hyperactive and impulsive diagnosis, absolutely. And that diagnostic criteria was only changed in 1980. The biggest issue the biggest challenge we've got with ADHD is that there's been no studies involving girls until the late 90s. And the first longitudinal study started in 2002. So what we need to be doing is we need to be making sure that we've got more longitudinal studies. We need to be training up our clinicians and making sure that we're making as much noise as we can, because we've got massive cohorts of women and girls who just don't have access to updated clinicians. And we need to be training, but then we need to be training, making sure that the police force, because at-risk girls are coming into contact with police who need updated training, and then teachers and professionals, so that we've got a holistic approach to at-risk girls, but it's not just at risk. It's you know, with an inattentive ADHD, you've got children who are girls who are conforming and have it and being misdiagnosed. And
yeah, I hear you about the need for people to have such a different understanding of not only just ADHD, but then how that intersects with some of our more insidious ideas about gender. You know, girls are quieter, girls are, you know, whatever the term is, promiscuous. That's why these things happen, as opposed to seeing it as a neurological issue. You know, it's more of a kind of social judgment. My last question, Lizzy, before I let you go, and I'm going to pick your brains about this later, I think, is about adults with ADHD in schools. So we have more people working in education who are now being diagnosed as adults, men and women, as having ADHD. How do schools cater for the needs of these individuals?
I think that's a brilliant question. I think I'm going to speak really bluntly, and I say, I think we as schools aren't the best at support. I'd love to see some excellent examples where schools are supporting the neurodiverse needs of their staff, and I'd love to hear from them, because they are out there. And I'd love to hear about them. I think that we don't have the right to question any of our staff, but I do think that we have the opportunity to promote and raise awareness. And I think that there are so many reasonable adjustments that we can put in place that are the same as we would offer to our children. And I think that there's still so much shame and stigma around there. And we can link it up so nicely with the menopause work that we're doing, because of the fluctuations in estrogen.
Absolutely. I think there definitely needs to be more awareness in the first instance, but what we then go on and do as a tangible action is
absolutely.
So I have to stop. I've yelled at. But thank you so much for joining us today, Lizzy. Please do stay in touch. Please do follow Lizzy at Pegs UK on Twitter. And we thank you for your time. Have a lovely Saturday.
Thanks so much, Benny, for the opportunity. Bye, everybody.